So a couple quick things as we get rolling here. You probably saw this in the ads in the pre-meeting, but we still have summer bees for sale. So if you are still short bees, then you've still got time. We're selling complete hives with our Texas 5000 queens, June through August. So we'll have these essentially till the 1st of September, and then we'll shut sales off. But we've got those with our 7-day guarantee for the next couple of months. Something new we're trying. This is just to see, this is an experiment, honestly. We are going to try and see how it goes running a special sale for everyone that listens to this webinar. And this will only be for 1 week. And so this will be for 1 week after the webinar. And so this will end on July the 8th. This sale will end, but until then, we've got 20% off of a lot of the most essential items that you need for this time of year. So bee brushes, syrup, Varroa Varroa testing stuff. You can use the coupon code July webinar, and you can use that coupon code on our website, or you can use it in store. So if you go in store, you can just tell them, hey, July webinar, and you can get 20% off any of these items. We'll also send this in the follow-up email. So the email we always send after this webinar, we'll put that in, all the details in there as well. Sherry, do you want to tell us what's going on in this this month's magazine?
Is there any way in the world that I could do that in less than, it is full. This month is full. We have 67 pages. And like I said last month, y'all download this because there's a lot of reading there. If you've got a question about what to do in July, it's in there. And I can't stress that enough. There's some super good, short, easy read articles. Download it and keep referring back to it because it is a go-to resource. Lots of videos, lots of great articles. That's it.
Fantastic. That's great, Sherry. Thank you.
You're welcome.
A couple final things I want to mention as we get rolling here. We have a Summer Splits virtual class that is this Saturday. So if you want to join us at 10 a.m., it's only $29 a person. We've got video, we've got PowerPoints, etc. But this is a virtual class on how to make summer splits. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up on our website. And then our very last in-person summer splits class is in our Dayton Huffman location, July the 10th. We tried to do all of our split classes earlier this year than usual, because honestly, if you're going to do summer splits, in my opinion, you need to do them before mid-July. So between July 4th and mid-July is when you need to have all your summer splits done. And so we tried to bump our classes earlier than normal so that you know what you're doing ahead of time instead of having a class in August, when it's already kind of too late for summer splits. With that, it's time to jump out into the bee yard and see what is going on with our bees. And so we are going to jump over into our bee yard portion of the night and take a look at a bee yard and a lot of bees and see what's going on there. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm back out in the Collin County Sheriff's Department bee yard, and we talked about it last month a bit when we were filming in the same bee yard, but this is a bee yard that we help the Sheriff's Detention Office maintain for the inmates to come out and learn about bees and beekeeping. And I thought it would be cool to come back and show you guys the exact same bee yard, the exact same hives as last month, to kind of give a comparison. If you remember last month, it was early June, it had been raining non-stop, and so even though these were super strong hives, they really only had like 0 to 20 pounds of honey stored up in their honey supers. So today, this is July 1st, we've had a month of sunshine. The last month has been warm, dry, and so we're gonna see what the bees did in that month period where they actually had some good weather. But it's been really hot at the same time, so we'll see if they've made a honey crop or not. So we're gonna dig in, we're gonna look at hives, look at for honey crop size, see if honey's ready to harvest, and we're also going to check some hives for Varroa mites. So that's what we've got on the menu for today. Let's get started. Okay, let's check this hive out. I'm kind of nervous. This is the first one to check, and we'll see what they have been doing in the last month. You know, if you remember, we had, like I mentioned before, we had all that rain, and then we've had hot and dry weather. Most people are saying that this has been one of the worst crops they've ever seen. Let's see if that holds true. So this is a double deep hive. They've got a medium super over a queen excluder. And here's what we've got. So that's all liquid honey. You can see it's nectar. It's not capped yet. They've just started capping just a little bit, but not a lot. This is one of the outside frames, obviously. So as we kind of move into the inside frames, here we go. So a lot more capped. You can see they've pretty much got this, you know, 2/3 to half capped with honey. So not bad. I mean, as I look through here, I mean, it's only one medium super, but this, they've got a little bit uncapped. They've capped this side. If you kind of go more to the outside frames, they've got nothing. So this hive has, well, about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 6 frames that are mostly full of honey, 6 medium frames, and the rest are pretty much empty. So, you know, maybe 20 pounds of honey, which is kind of normal. But one quick thing is that, you know, you can see I've got all these frames like this that aren't capped yet, but I'm betting they're ready to harvest because it's already July 1st. The honey flow is really winding down, and sometimes near the end of the honey flow, bees just don't finish capping everything. So what I always do is a shake test, where I just shake it really hard above the frame, above the top bars, and see if any liquid comes out. And a few drops came out, but that's about it. So that tells me that this honey is pretty cured. You know, I might give it maybe another week, and we'll probably start pulling honey off of this hive in about a week. So let's check out some other hives, see if they did any better or if they did worse. So you guys may or may not remember, but this particular hive was super strong. It was 2 deep boxes, 2 deep brood boxes, and then a deep honey super and a medium super, and they were just bursting at the seams. They were an incredibly strong hive. But a month ago, they had almost no honey in it because they were so strong. They were eating all the honey as it was being brought in, which is something you do see on very poor crop years like this one. So let's take a look and let's see if they rebounded at all over the past month, or if they ate more of their honey. I'm hoping that since they were a really strong hive, that when we got a couple nice weeks of weather, they quickly bounced back and stored some honey. But you just never know. Bees have a mind of their own, and they're dependent on the weather too. So all right, so look at that. Our top medium honey super, that's capped honey. So that's a great sign. As we look more to the middle, oh, beautiful. That is beautiful. Look at that, completely capped, both sides. That's a beautiful frame of honey. So this top medium has about 8 of the frames pretty much full of honey. And let's see how heavy it feels. It feels like it's got about 25 to 30 pounds of honey in it. So not bad. Let's see what the deep box has, the deep honey super. It's pretty hot out here today, so the bees aren't caring much what I'm doing to them. So on the outside frames in the honey super, we've got some capped honey there at the top, some uncapped at the bottom. The other side is completely empty. So what these bees did is they did something we call chimneying, where they, if you put on a couple honey supers at the same time, instead of waiting till one's 80% full and then adding another one, you'll often see the bees go up into the honey supers and kind of fill up the middles of both of the honey supers instead of filling up one completely and then another one. So in that top medium super, you know, the outside couple frames were totally empty. In this deep super, the outside frames are also pretty empty. That's really normal to see a hive to do that. However, the great thing is that the center frames are pretty stinking full of honey. I'm kind of excited to see this. I wasn't really expecting it to have this much honey in it because again, a month ago, around the 1st of June, it was pretty much empty. Now we've got probably 40 pounds of honey, I'm guessing, up in this second deep box, or the third deep box, or our honey super. Let me lift up and see. So yeah, I would say it's got about 40 pounds of honey in it. The top one probably has 20 to 30. So, you know, 50, 60-ish pounds. That's not bad on a year like this. Now, remember, this was a second year hive and it was incredibly strong. I mean, it was bursting at the seams. So I'm not surprised necessarily. I'm a little surprised, but if any hive was going to make a crop, it would be one like this. So good news, they actually made some honey. Hey guys, so let's check this hive out real quick. I just went through it and I always hate it how a lot of beekeepers, and I've been guilty of it too, but a lot of times we show the best hives, the best looking frames of brood, the hives that are the fullest with bees. And sometimes it can give us an unrealistic picture of what hives look like in general. So we just looked at a hive that was actually doing really well, had made a really decent honey crop for a year like this. So this hive right next to it had about 0 to 20 pounds of honey up in its super, so just a couple of frames of honey up in its super, so they really didn't make a crop. And that made me go, I wonder if there's something wrong with it. So I looked down into the bottom brood boxes and there is no brood whatsoever. So I mean, this is what the frames are looking like in the brood box. I mean, it's just, there's no brood, no eggs, no larvae. I'm holding this frame so the sunlight shines right down into those cells, and I'm not seeing any eggs in either box. I'm also not seeing any queen cells that have hatched out, which means this hive's potentially been queenless for quite some time. They've already chewed down the queen cells and the new queen never was accepted, or something happened to her. But you can see, I mean, this is our second brood box, and they're basically backfilling all the brood area with honey. And so that's something you don't want to see. It's okay if it's happening on the outside frames, but on those inside frames in the center of the box and the brood nest, you shouldn't see frames, full of nectar in the center of the frames. Around the edges like this capped honey around the edge, that's fine, that's normal. But I don't want to see, the cells in the center filled with nectar and no brood. So this hive is going to get a new queen. So we're going to pull what little honey it does have up above on our medium box supers that I've already pulled off. And then we're going to give them a new queen and they should be fine. They've got all summer to recover. So this hive is kind of more of the same. We're not going to dig down deep into it, but it's got about 40 pounds of honey on it, which again, I'm kind of thrilled with on a year like this. This whole yard, since we have a lot of people coming into this bee yard, these are all of our super gentle golden Cordovan queens. They've done really well this year. I mean, most of them have about 40 pounds of honey on them. You can see this one up here has a beautiful frame of capped honey that looks great. One thing we have to do, it's an absolute essential task that you always need to do if you're a beekeeper. You need to taste the honey to see if it's good or not. I mean, this is the you're going, of course it's good, it's my bees. This is the best part of beekeeping. You can go out to your bee yard and you can take a scoop of honey and taste it. Wow, that is really good. I'm tasting a lot of Scabiosa in it. So if you're in north central Texas or North Texas, we have a lot of a plant called pincushion or Scabiosa, and it almost gives the honey a bit of a fruity, citrusy taste, a bit, and I'm tasting a lot of that. You know, we also have a lot of Indian blanket or Gaillardia, and it tends to give honey more of a really yellow color and a little more of a mild flavor. And then in South Texas, Southeast Texas, you've got a lot of Chinese tallow, and that tends to have just a bit of a stronger flavor, a little more pronounced. A lot of people call it robust, a little more of a robust flavor. But it's absolutely delicious honey. One quick thing I want to show you, after I harvest my honey on my hives, I don't really do it before I harvest, but after I harvest, just to keep the hive a little bit cooler, it's not a bad idea to give them some upper ventilation. And the way I usually do that is I just get a little stick, you know, a small stick, popsicle stick works well. And between my outer cover and inner cover, I just put a little gap in it like this. And it's just creating, you know, just really an airway, as long as your stick doesn't break. Come on, stick. As long as you're, it just creates a very, very small little airway to give the bees a little bit of upper ventilation. I only do this with strong hives because you don't want to create a robbing situation. If you've got a weaker hive, you know, that's just kind of an open invitation for robber bees to come in. So if you have any issues with robbing or you've got a weak hive, I don't do this too. But for a really strong hive with 2 boxes after I harvest honey, I like giving them a little bit of upper ventilation. I also sometimes just put a 3rd box on top of my hives after I harvest the honey and kind of let that 3rd box be dead air space, or space if the bees need it, and then I'll pull it off in the fall as we go into winter. So one of my new favorite ways of doing checking for Varroa mites is using a sticky board. And so we have these sticky boards that you can buy them with this protective screen, and it goes right over the top of the sticky board. And the purpose is to keep the bees off of the sticky portion of the sticky board. If you've got a screen bottom board, you really don't need this protective screen, because this can actually slide right underneath your screen bottom board, and the screen itself will protect the bees from getting on the sticky part. So all you have to do to use these things is you peel off the plastic to expose the sticky part. You slide it underneath your screen bottom board, just like that. You wait 24 hours and then you count your mite drops. After 24 hours, if you've got more than about 10 Varroa mites, you need to do some sort of treatment or take some form of action. And if you've got less than that, you're good to go. So it's a very non-invasive, quick, easy way to test for Varroa mites. So we'll come back and check this hive in a bit, in about an hour or 2. You're supposed to wait 24 hours, but we'll come back in about an hour and see if there's anything left on it. So we're back at this hive that we put the sticky board under, and about an hour later, ideally you're gonna wait 24, well, you must wait 24 hours. Right at 24 hours. You don't wanna do it at an hour or 2 days, because then it messes up those threshold numbers. But it's been about an hour, and I was just curious to see if anything's happened, and not much. I mean, there's a little bit of debris on here. We've successfully caught a small hive beetle. That's always exciting. I love catching small hive beetles. Just as a quick reminder, a couple small hive beetles, if I see under a dozen adult small hive beetles in a hive, I'm really not that concerned. If I'm seeing, 20, 30, 40 small hive beetles in a hive, that's when I get a little more concerned. But I'm seeing some debris on here. I'm not seeing any Varroa mites. Again, it's not a fair test because we didn't wait 24 hours. But the concept is you just stick it in, wait 24 hours, pull it out, bring it inside where it's nice and a little darker, and you can really count the Varroa mites on this sticky board. And they're pretty visible typically, even though they're small. They look different than other debris, and it's not too hard to count. And if you've got over 10, then you need to take action. Under 10 and shouldn't be a problem. Okay, so let's do an alcohol wash with a beehive. Now this is the most destructive mite test because it does kill the bees. But it's also the most accurate. So if you're wanting to be really accurate on your Varroa mite counts, an alcohol wash is by far the most accurate method. So I've got my easy tester here, easy check Varroa thing. We sell these. I highly recommend them. They're pretty easy to use, all in one piece. I've got my alcohol, and I'm gonna usually put about 2 cups of alcohol into this container before I get my bees. So the more the merrier on the alcohol wash, but usually about 2 cups, or pretty much one of these containers, about 2/3 of this container. So I've got my alcohol ready, I've got my tester ready. Now I've got to get the bees, and I want to pull bees out of the brood nest area. I've also got my piece of paper that I'm going to shake the bees on to then funnel them, to shake them into the test. So let's find some bees. So I've got I usually recommend doing a test in early July. Most people harvest their honey around the 4th of July. And this year is really no different. Most regions here in the next week or so, you're good to go pulling your honey. But usually I do a mite test after I pull my honey, as long as it's not later than, I'd say, mid-July. Then I'll do my mite test after I pull honey, because I'm not really going to be able to do anything about the mite counts until I've got all these honey supers off. So, but since we haven't harvested honey on these bees yet, I am going to just pull the super off. It's got about 40 pounds in it. That was a good one. Pull my queen excluder off. And now I'm going to get a frame of bees. You can get it out of the top brood box, that's fine. I'm going to get a frame of bees that we're going to use to do this mite test. And you may have to get a couple frames of bees. You may not get enough off of one frame. Your goal is 300 bees. So here's our frame of brood. Not a lot of bees on it. It's tough when it's so hot outside. You'll often have pretty low populations when it's really hot, because all the bees are out foraging, or they're kind of at the bottom of the hive to help keep it cool. But an important step is to look for the queen. You don't want the queen to be on the frame that you're shaking bees off of, because that would be a shame, because the bees are gonna not survive. So I've got my frame of bees. I'm shaking them off. You don't have to move that quickly. You mostly want nurse bees, and so the foragers will fly away. The nurse bees will stay on the page, and then you just shake them into that container. Now, there's a fill line on the container that shows how many bees you need to get to that 300 bee threshold. And so you want to keep shaking them in. Usually it takes about 2 frames of bees to get to that 300 bee threshold. So I'm not seeing the queen. Queen's not on this frame. So I'm going to repeat the process. Shake the bees, funnel them up, and dump them in. So if you're worried about your hive and losing 300 bees, I mean, keep in mind, most hives that are good and strong have, 20 to 50,000 bees. So a loss of 300 bees isn't really going to hurt them at all. And Varroa mites being out of control will absolutely kill your hive. So a test is well worth it. So I've got the lid back on. I'm going to kind of swirl that alcohol around for just 30 seconds or so to make sure that we are rinsing all those Varroa mites off of those bees. And then we're going to look in the bottom of this container and take a look at how many Varroa mites we've got. Now, when you've got 300 bees in a sample, anything over 2 mites per 100 bees is typically considered a problem. So if you've got 6 mites, if we find 6 mites in this test, then we're going to need to do something about it. If I've got under 6, then I'm going to continue monitoring this hive. I'll probably check it again in a month for Varroa mite levels, but I might not need to treat yet. So let's see what we've got here. So well, we've got quite a few mites. I don't know if you guys can see them or not, but there are probably about 10 mites or so, and you can see the little specks here in the bottom. You may not be able to see it on the camera really well, but they're very obvious looking at them. So, you know, I'm at, you know, 3 to 4 mites per 100 bees in this hive. So I'm gonna pull this honey here in the next week, and then with mite levels that are that high, I'm gonna go ahead and do a mite treatment. Probably here in the next week or so, I'll do a treatment. And we'll talk later about, and you can see our other resources on what types of treatments to use. But you know, it's interesting because this hive still looks great. I mean, there's still 2 boxes packed full of bees, so they're handling the mites pretty well. You know, we try to get bees and breed and select for mite resistant bees, but even though they're handling it well right now, those Varroa mite levels are going to continue to climb through the summer, and will probably reach a point at which the hive, no matter how resistant it is, can't survive. So we're going to take some action on this one. We'll probably try to use something natural like a hop guard or Apiguard first, and if that doesn't work, you know, we'll kind of move up the IPM pyramid and find something that'll really work if necessary. So anyway, good to test. It's good to know. If you don't test, you don't know. Don't rely on visual cues to see if your hive has a problem or not. And so now we'll get this honey off and get this hive taken care of in the next week or so. Okay, so just a quick summary now that we're done looking at the bees. I mean, overall they did better than I expected. I mean, you know, with all the rains we had, being really strong second year hives that were 2 deep boxes full of bees and brood going into the honey flow, they still managed to pull off probably a 40-pound average crop, I'm guessing. The hives that were first year hives basically did nothing. So it was only the best of the best that really did something. We've had great rains in Texas and the South, really over the past couple of months. The rains have certainly slowed down, but everything is still really green. But even though we've had good rains, you know, I'm not seeing a whole lot blooming. This is Scabiosa that I've mentioned a couple of times. It's kind of a long plant, about waist high. These are the blooms off of it. And I'm still seeing some of this blooming. I mean, not a lot. I would say that 80% of it's dead, but there's still about 20% blooming. I'm still seeing some white clovers. This is a white clover. The yellow clover looks just the same. A little bit of this is still blooming, but again, about 80% of it's gone. I'm seeing a little bit of ball clover still blooming as well in some areas. But again, with kind of all these plants, about 80 to 90% of it's done, and we'll kind of wrap up over the next week in most areas as it starts getting hotter and hotter. So honey flow is about done. I would plan on pulling honey in pretty much any region in Texas and then within the next week. There might be some pockets of exception with that, but by and large, it's time. What they've done is what they've done, and hopefully next year will be better than this year. Okay, folks, so there you have it. That's kind of where we are at the moment in those hives. So let's jump right into some things that were not covered in that video. This is just a depressing picture that's in the background of this presentation, or this slide. This was North Dakota. These are some of our bees commercially in North Dakota. The picture on the right was last year at about this time. You can see we had floods, and the picture on the left is this year, and most areas haven't had much measurable rainfall since last fall. I mean, it's just stunning how much the weather can shift, and in those regions, in any region. So I know that it's hot outside. Winter preparation is the last thing on our mind as beekeeping, but just one little tidbit to keep in mind as we go through this is winter preparation for your bees starts as soon as you harvest honey. So when you pull that honey off the hive, the next big event for your bees is winter. And everything we do over the course of the summer and the fall has a tremendous impact on whether or not our bees survive the coming winter. So what we're going to be talking about tonight and focusing in on is how to keep your bees healthy through the summer, which in turn will keep them alive and strong during winter. If you wait till October, November, you know, until those first cold fronts start blowing in to prep your bees for winter,
it's too late. You can't really do much for a beehive really once the cold weather starts. So this is our window of opportunity, the next 3 or 4 months to get our bees ready for winter. Some summer blooms that are coming on. I mean, we've had really good rains in Texas. I mean, it's still, we essentially have no drought in Texas except for far, far west Texas. There is drought, but I mean, the majority of the state, there is no drought. I mean, it's completely drought free. So we should have a lot of summer blooms, the sunflowers, the crepe myrtles, the thistles, the sumac. There's a lot of the goldenrod will be coming on in a couple of months. I mean, there's a lot that should continue blooming over this summer. So even though I don't feel great about the honey flow we just had, I feel pretty good about the upcoming summer as long as we keep getting some rains occasionally. So kind of along with that, what did everybody experience during the honey flow? I mean, excessive rains in June, or excessive rains in May and the first part of June switched over to really hot, dry conditions in a lot of regions, except for like Southeast Texas, where you guys in Southeast Texas, I don't think it's not rained for like any 2-day period since spring. It's amazing how much rain has fallen in Southeast Texas, but a lot of the rest of the state dried out a lot over June. And overall production appears pretty sporadic. A lot of beekeepers I'm hearing are reporting the worst crop they've ever had. I personally had the worst crop I've ever had in Texas. So our commercial beekeeping operation, we averaged, about, 20 pounds in Texas, and that's the worst than I've ever done before. So kind of current conditions, the honey flows are largely coming to an end. I mentioned that in the video there, even though it's still green outside, the honey flows are wrapping up. Abundant rains are keeping a good trickle of nectar flowing later than normal. So there is still a trickle. So if you don't have to rush out there and pull honey by the 4th of July, but the first half of July, I would get your honey pulled. It's shaping up to be a below average year for honey, but possibly better than average for summer, which is super important. A lot of summers, I recommend you start feeding pollen substitute in July, just because all the natural forage starts dying. I'm not really going to recommend that this year. I mean, if you want to go above and beyond, you can start giving your bees pollen patties. It's not going to hurt them, that's for sure. It's definitely going to increase brood production and help them be stronger, but I don't recommend it as much as I do most years, just because I think we're going to have a pretty good pollen flow throughout the month of July. I want to launch a really quick poll for you guys because I'm just curious. This poll is asking how much honey, surplus honey, have your bees stored in their supers to date. So these, since we have so many Southern and Texas beekeepers on the call, it's always a decent overview of how production actually turned out in the state. And a lot of folks I've talked to, there's been a wild difference between first-year hives and second-year hives. If you have a first-year hive that still had to draw out all that new foundation, a lot of those just didn't make anything. Second-year hives that had a lot of pre-drawn foundation, kind of like what we saw in the video, some of those tended to make something of a crop. So most of you have voted here. It looks like about 50% made 0 to 10 pounds. So the majority made 0 to 10 pounds essentially. Then looks like 26% made 11 to 20 pounds, 11% made 21 to 30 pounds, and then it kind of goes down from there. So I'll have to pull the poll. I think I asked the same question at last year's webinar in July. And I want to say we were more like, 40, 50 pound average was more of the norm. So definitely below normal. So, and that's agriculture. Unfortunately, we're so dependent on weather that it's tough to predict, and you never know what your year is going to hold. But this has been an exceptionally poor year for honey production. By the way, expect to see honey prices go up in the grocery store. I know we're all beekeepers, so most of us aren't in the grocery store buying honey, but we're looking at nationwide a pretty significant reduction in crop size, both in the South and the northern states this year. So there's definitely going to be some major honey shortages. All right, getting into bees. So a couple things you're probably going to start noticing in your hive is one, something I like to call summer brood. When the brood starts looking a little more spotty than normal, then you can see in this picture, you've got some decent brood, but they've got some nectar stored in there, and the queen isn't laying everywhere. Really, really, a really nice, beautiful pattern. And that's pretty common. I see this a lot in summer hives. The need for the same quantity of brood isn't as great, and so seeing that more spotty brood is pretty normal. If it's like significantly worse than this picture and it's on all the frames in the hive, then I start questioning, okay, maybe my queen is failing. But if it looks about like this on most of the frames, that's pretty normal for the summer. Another really common question, we're just kind of hitting a lot of quick topics here. Another common question is, do I add boxes during the summer? When should I stop adding supers? And I would say now. I would not add another honey super this late in the year. So kind of whatever honey supers your hives have, I would leave it be. If you're lucky enough to be in an area where all your honey supers are 100% packed full and you still see a lot of flowers blooming, you can throw another super on to see what they'll do. But that's definitely going to be an exception to the rule. 98% of us have no reason to continue adding supers. After you pull your honey, I'll talk about this more in a minute, but I like to put one of my honey supers back on the hive during the summer just to keep the bees cooler. If your hive is currently just one deep box of bees and you've never gotten around to adding that second deep or second brood box, excuse me, then I would go ahead and do that now. So if you have one single story hive that's, I'm going to say this time of year, 50% full of bees or more, I would go ahead and add a second box because they may not quite need that space yet, but that second box is going to help keep them cooler in the summer. And so I would go ahead and add it, keep trickle feeding, and hopefully they'll draw out and move up into that second brood box. I don't like going through the summer with just a single brood box and no upper boxes because they just get really, really hot. Now, if the hive's in full shade, which I don't recommend, then I can over summer in singles, but I don't like singles out in the full sun without at least a second box on them. If both of your brood boxes, if you do have two brood boxes and both are full, completely full of bees, should you add another box? Throughout the summer, yes. I mean, if you've got two deep boxes or a deep and a medium and they're packed, almost 100% full of bees, I do tend to add a third empty box after harvest, just to give them plenty of room to breathe, through the summer. If you've got two brood boxes and they're only, 2/3 full of bees each, then I wouldn't necessarily add a third box. It's not going to hurt them to give them some dead air space and keep them a little cooler, but it's not as critical. All right, so let's talk a bit about everybody's least favorite topic, which is Varroa mites. I mean, we all hate these things with a passion, but it's the leading cause of hive death. And this is the time of year the Varroa population typically hits critical levels in July and August. It's the leading cause of winter death, and winter death is in quotation marks because usually hives hit critical levels of Varroa mites in July and August, but they don't kill the hive right away. They significantly weaken the hive. They transmit a lot of viruses to those bees, and you don't actually see a full collapse of the bees until later in the winter, and then you see your bees die. It often starts back in the summer because Varroa mites got out of control. Keep in mind, visual inspections for Varroa mites is pointless. Virtually all hives in the country have mites. You've got to do a test like you saw in the video, an alcohol wash or sticky board test. And we'll talk about those in a minute. One quick thing, we did have a natural and chemical Varroa control webinar class, virtual class a couple of weekends ago. We have that. It was really popular. A lot of folks were saying, hey, we didn't make the call. Can we still buy it? So you can go to our website and buy a recording. of that 2-hour class that kind of takes a deep dive into Varroa mites, how to treat them in Texas, both organically, mechanically, and chemically, and genetically. So it kind of goes into all that. $29. So if you want to take a much deeper dive than we're going to do tonight, which I recommend, that recording is available for you.
We'd like to introduce you to the Varroa Mite. Well, to be
So sorry if I freaked you guys out. That was a little bit loud. I want to show this quick video from our friends over at Mite Away. They created a really cool video that it's about a minute long, and it shows the quick life cycle of the Varroa mite. So we're going to watch that real quick, and then we'll move on.
To be precise, we'd like to introduce you to millions of Varroa mites. Why so many? Well, when it comes to the Varroa mite, there's no such thing as just one. And if you'd like to see how an infestation starts, you need to look no further than your own bees, especially drones, as they're pretty social and like to travel between hives. Since Varroa mites don't have any wings of their own, they slip into hives by hitching a ride on the backs of adult bees. And for the lucky mite, the trip includes an in-flight meal, as Varroa mites will begin feeding on bee blood within a few minutes of clinging to the bee. Once they've entered the hive, Varroa mites slip undetected into the vulnerable, uncapped brood cells. This is where the mites lay in wait until the bees cap the brood. Once a cell is capped, the mother mite, like a tiny vampire, climbs atop the cocoon of the developing bee, tears open a hole, and begins to feed on its blood. Within 3 days, the mother mite lays her first egg, which always develops into a male. Then, she lays one female egg every 30 hours over the next week or so in her newly acquired home under the brood cap. And as each of these female mites mature, they mate with their brother. By the time the baby bee develops and leaves its infested cell, as many as 3 fertilized mites will emerge with it, and the cycle continues. Using this strategy, the Varroa mite population can grow as fast as the bee population it feeds on. But when summer ends and the bee population declines, the hive is left with a huge mite population, and that's dangerous. Too many mites in a hive will overwhelm and kill entire bee. We'd like to introduce you to the Varroa mite.
Oops. Okay. All right. We're going to stop there. So that's just a great quick overview. Kind of like you saw in that chart, these are the Texas hive growth trends. So this is, in general, this is something we created, but it's not. This is in general the growth pattern that we see in hives in Texas. So this far left are frames of bees, and this tallest gray bar is our goal for the number of frames of bees we have in our hives each month. The brown bar, or the gray, whatever color that is, the brownish bar is a hive that needs work. So that's not a great bee population, needs some work. And then the green bar is essentially beyond saving for each month that time of year. Doesn't mean you have to get rid of it, but they probably aren't going to survive if they're at that point, that time of year. So anyway, the general point of the chart is that you can see that the levels, typically the population tends to start peaking in May and June, and then starts dropping back down over the summer months. And so that's a very natural growth decline and trend for Texas. So kind of along with that, this is the Varroa threat trend. So this is the kind of the growth trend for Varroa mites, like you saw in the video. It ramps up as the bee population increases, kind of gets to that critical level July, August, and September, and then declines with the bee population, or as the bees die from Varroa mites. Quick reminder, these are visual signs of Varroa mites. However, don't rely on visual signs for Varroa mites. If you see bees with deformed wings, that's a sign of a Varroa mite. You see that center picture and the upper right picture, those are deformed wings. That's kind of a classic symptom. You can see Varroa mites visually in brood, especially in drone brood. You may see really spotty brood that can be a result of the hygienic behavior, where the bees are pulling Varroa mites out of and brood out of the brood cells. However, the majority of the time, Varroa mites are located underneath capped cells, or on the underside of a worker bee's abdomen, wedged between her wax gland or wax plates. So this picture on the far right that you see here, this Varroa mite conveniently perched on a bee's back, that's not normal. Varroa mites are not usually located there. So don't ever rely on, I talk to folks sometimes that say, hey, I don't see any Varroa mites, so I don't think I've got a problem. Well, you aren't usually going to see Varroa mites. They're usually going to be pretty hidden. So don't rely on visual inspection. Couple quick things before we wrap up Varroa mites is just some testing details. A lot of folks say, well, how many hives should I test and how often should I test? As far as how many, depends on how many hives you've got. If you've only got 2 or 3 hives, I would test each one of them. If you've got more than that, I usually test, if you've got 20 or 30 hives, I usually only test about 10 to 15%. If you've got 10 hives, I'd probably test 3 or 4 of them. In general, in most cases, what you find in one hive in a bee yard, you're going to find in most of the beehives in the bee yard. Usually if I test, 3 hives out of 10 and the Varroa mite levels are all out of control, I'm going to see that in the rest of my hives. So you don't have to test every hive, but you want to test, a fair number of them to get a good feel for what your counts are. And then how often to test, I usually test, critically in July, and then about every 6 weeks after that until October or so, I'm going to do a test just to make sure my levels aren't peaking again, even after a treatment. I'm not going to go over the powdered sugar roll test a lot. It's a common one. You've probably heard of it. It's a method for testing Varroa mites using powdered sugar. The advantage of the powdered sugar test is it does not kill bees, which a lot of people love. We've got more information on our website and our YouTube channel about how to do this test. The directions are all right here. And so you can refer back to this recording to see those directions. The reason I don't really get into it is it's the least accurate test. So this can give you a general feel for what your Varroa mite levels are, but it's the least accurate test. And the alcohol wash or the sticky board is really what I'd recommend. I talked about sticky boards in the video, so I won't get into it much other than to remind you that don't inspect the hive within 24 hours of inserting that sticky board, because when you inspect a hive, it really disturbs the bees and you might create an abnormal Varroa mite fall from the bees. So don't inspect your hive within about 1 day of before you add the sticky board. Insert that sticky board, let it sit for 24 hours, pull it out, count the mites. For about 10 mites, you've got a problem. Okay, so a couple quick things on treating Varroa mites. So I want to give you a quick overview of where the industry has kind of been in the past when it came to treating for Varroa mites and where the future is. Essentially, in the past, we kind of saw a constant cycle of treatments, developing new chemical treatments. The Varroa mites built a resistance to those treatments and the new treatments being developed. The industry pretty much agrees these days that reducing synthetic chemical use in our hives and relying on genetics is the future for bees and beekeeping. There's increasingly promising research occurring in genetics, but we're not quite there yet. Varroa tools aren't quite, total Varroa control has not, in most cases, been achieved just relying on genetics. I do believe that hopefully within the next decade, hopefully even sooner, you'll be able to just buy a queen that's resistant to mites and stick her in your hives and not worry about mites anymore. I have yet to find a breeder that has that achieved. And we buy bees from all the different breeders. We're a part of a number of scientific studies where breeders are raising Varroa mite resistant queens. We're careful with our own development as well. And there is a lot of promise out there. Every year that Varroa mite resistance gets better and better. But in most cases, we're still only about a 20 to 30% control. And so I just don't quite feel right telling beekeepers, hey, buy our Varroa mite resistant queens and don't worry about mites anymore. Sure, some of them will make it, without treatment, but a lot of them won't. And so I really advocate testing to make sure you know where your levels are, regardless of what kind of queens you have. The other thing is, no matter what kind of queen you get, that queen can die and the hive requeens themselves and you never know it. That happens all the time. And then that new queen isn't going to have the same resistant traits. She may have some of them, but not anything like the mother queen did. For control options, number one, you can use chemical control. You can use mechanical or chemical-free control, genetics or breeding only, or an integrative pest management approach to all the methods, which is what I recommend. If you kind of want to get down into details on each one of these treatment options, I'm sorry, it's not a sales pitch, but go pay $29 and watch that recording, because we just can't cover all those different options and all the different sub options in the webinar tonight, but that recording does get into all of that. When you're trying to choose what method you want to go in beekeeping, chemical-free, treatment-free, using chemicals, etc., I always encourage folks to be realistic with yourself. You need to know and understand the pros and cons of each method, but remember that doing nothing is not an option. Or at least if you do nothing, you need to know that the majority of your bees will die. There are varying classes of chemicals ranging from synthetic to natural ingredients. Natural ingredients don't always equate to better for bees. You know, all the acids, for example, oxalic acid, formic acid, they're pretty natural, but they're acids and they're pretty rough on the bees. So make sure you understand the treatments, the pros, the cons of each one of them. If you just want to use a chemical treatment that's just gonna work, Apivar is the most commonly used one. It's a synthetic miticide. It's a strip that's stuck in the hive, super easy. Some of the more natural ones like Apigard, which is a thymol based, or HopGuard, they do work, but they aren't quite as effective, but they are more natural. And then you can go all the way to completely treatment-free methods. And in that recording, we definitely outlined a couple of those that are very effective for Texas. So I wanted to we want to hear from Lauren Ward really quickly, answering a very important question, which is, if I don't treat my bees for mites, will they become resistant to Varroa mites? So let's see what Lauren has to say about that.
So this is a fun question. If you don't treat for mites, will your bees become resistant to mites? I would go back and I would say, just not treating for mites is ignoring the problem. It's not the same thing as being what we call a treatment-free beekeeper, which is also open for discussion what exactly that is. So what will happen if you don't treat for mites is, if you have really conventional kind of bees, the stock that isn't necessarily very resistant to mites at all, is you're probably going to lose a lot of those bees. And you may lose them fairly early. You may wait and have really good populations going into winter, and then the viruses that are associated with mites will just take them down. So you'll go from a booming double deep to 2 frames of bees or dead. And you'll never see what happened in the middle of that a lot of the time. So just not treating is not really a great option. In other situations, you can maybe not treat and some of your hives will die, but then a lot of the times what will happen is some of them will requeen, and maybe requeen with some more Africanized stock that maybe is a little more resistant. And so that might be the only hive you have left, but it's not a pleasant hive to work because there's always a trade-off between these things. And so really, it's not that you don't have to be treatment-free or not treatment-free. So these are all options for you. But if you're going towards the treatment-free side, you really have to do your homework. And you have to have other methods in place. So you really, it'll all be based on, and we'll get to this question later, but mite resistant queens, that's a very important thing to have if you're not going to be treating a lot or at all. But then there's also a lot of other methods, cultural methods. So how are you doing your beekeeping? Treatment-free beekeepers really do a whole lot of monitoring. They learn a lot about their bees, a lot about how their bees build up in their environment. And so it's really complex. So treatment-free is a lot more complicated than treating. And I'll say on the other side of that, treating does not mean you have to treat to the nth degree. So there's a spectrum all in the middle. And so, yeah, don't go out and get bees, period. And just sort of expect that if you don't treat them, they're going to adapt on their own. So I kind of liken it to, if you live in the Arctic Circle and you decide that, instead of a husky as a pet, I want a Chihuahua. It's not going to just adapt. You're gonna have to bring it inside. You're probably gonna need some sweaters and booties. It's not going to just adapt, it's going to die. And maybe a husky will move into its place, but that's your best bet. So like I said, it's a complicated answer, it's a complicated question. And I don't like to push people too hard in one way or the other, because there's several right answers at least. But yeah, just ignoring a problem does not fix it. Period.
Perfect. So, and one thing that I want to add is I often recommend it for first-year beekeepers to use a more conventional miticide, just because it's so, like Lauren alluded to, it's so much simpler than some of these more challenging processes like mechanical or genetic, et cetera. So, but one thing I do love, once you kind of got past your first year in beekeeping and do understand beekeeping, this is what I do, is use I love this pyramid that's the Integrative Pest Management pyramid. And the starting point is right here at the bottom. And so we start with genetics. We start getting good bees that are as mite resistant as we can get. And then we move up. If that doesn't solve the problem, which generally genetics alone frequently don't, then we move up into a mechanical approach where maybe we do brood breaks. In that recording, I talked about a method I've been experimenting with that essentially traps the queen bee onto a frame of drone brood. All the Varroa mites go into the drone brood, and then you freeze that frame of drone brood and kill all the mites in the hive. I completely simplified a very critically detailed process there, but there are mechanical methods that are very effective at controlling mites. If that's not working, then you can move up into the organic chemicals like HopGuard, formic acid, oxalic acid. If that's not working, then you can go up to conventional or like Amitraz or Apivar. Amitraz is the active ingredient. So this is what I really recommend. If you're brand new to beekeeping though, you might want to just start with one of these top two because they're very simple. You order it in a package, instructions come with it, you stick it in the hive, and generally it does the trick. So, okay. So in the time we've got left, I'm going to take just a couple more minutes and then we'll turn it over to the Eloms as they talk about harvesting or how to know when it's time to harvest honey. I want to briefly touch on what your bees need in the upcoming summer months. So this is what a hive needs to survive and thrive. They need protein. They need a variety of protein. They need carbs. They need largely mite-free populations. They need to be largely free of brood disease and a healthy, vibrant queen. So if you're looking kind of your checklist for the summer, that's what bees need in general to survive. I've talked a lot in the past about fat bees versus skinny bees, where if you want to jump in, you can go watch our July webinar on our website from 2020. And I went into this in a lot more depth because July of last year was a whole lot hotter and drier than this year. This year, it's not quite as relevant because we've actually had great rains. But if there isn't enough natural forage for the bees, if there's not much natural pollen coming in, if there's not much natural nectar coming in, then bees' fat cells begin to shrink in their bodies and they become skinny bees. And their immune system kind of tanks right along with that. If there is ample pollen coming in and lots of nectar and lots of flowers blooming, the bees' fat cells are really robust and they're able to resist disease a lot more easily, resist Varroa mites a little bit more easily. Their immune systems are better. They're able to raise the bees that are going to survive over the winter. So, you'll probably see a difference in the stored pollen from spring to summer. This picture on the far right is what we often see in the springtime, which is, beautiful frames, half full of pollen, versus in the summertime, you kind of see a sprinkling of pollen around the edges, or pollen kind of sprinkled in throughout the brood. And again, like I mentioned earlier, July of this year, I'm really not too concerned about giving my bees a pollen substitute, because I think we're going to have pretty good pollen flow through the month of July because we've had so much rain. But in August, I often plan on giving my bees some supplemental pollen substitute, a pollen patty, to make sure that they continue rearing enough bees to survive the winter. So we're going to talk more about pollen patties in August. I'm not going to touch much on it in July because I think we are going to be in good shape through the month of July. One quick side note, this is something you can do in your hives, is learn to look at well-fed larvae in a hive versus hungry larvae. The picture on the far right, these are well-fed larvae. You can see that these little larvae are just absolutely floating in that royal jelly, versus these larvae on the left, you don't really see any royal jelly in those cells. There's virtually none. So if you're not seeing that royal jelly around those small larvae, that's concerning to me. It tells me that the bees are a little bit nutritionally and in a little bit of a nutritional deficit. And I'm going to give them a pollen patty and maybe a little bit of syrup if they don't have sufficient stores in the hive. There is a difference in well-fed hives versus overfed hives. And in that video earlier in the bee yard, you kind of saw that one hive that was queenless and how they were filling in all the brood area with nectar or syrup. I don't want to see that. If you're seeing that in a hive that does have a queen and they're filling in kind of those center frames in the brood nest with nectar, kind of like you see on this picture on the far left, that tells me that they're overfed, or they don't have enough honey supers on and they have nowhere left to store honey. And so they're storing it in the brood nest. That's a sign that we need to slack off on the feeding or add a honey super. Versus a picture on the far right, you've got good brood and then you've got a band of honey up around that edge. That's exactly what I want to see in a hive. Good brood in the center of the frame, plenty of honey around the outside edges. I want to quickly touch on summer trickle feeding. And what I mean by this is my favorite thing to do over the summer. And that is to feed the bees a little bit of pollen substitute and a little bit of sugar water throughout the summer to kind of simulate a natural nectar flow by just giving them a little bit of nectar and a little or syrup and a little bit of pollen patties. What that usually looks like is feeding 2 1-pound pollen patties per month. You don't want to give them more than they can eat in about 1 week. And then for sugar syrup, that looks like feeding about 1/4 to 1 gallon, 1/2 gallon of syrup per week until the hive has at least 30 pounds of surplus stored up in the second brood box. I'm not emphasizing this quite as much for July because my guess is most of you probably have sufficient pollen stores. So I would really kind of kick in on this trickle feeding for most folks in August. Now, if your hive only has 1 brood box right now, it's only 1 box, then definitely feed that syrup, add your second brood box, and get them to start drawing out that second brood box. But for a hive that's already 2 deeps or 2 brood boxes, mostly full of bees and brood and honey, you may not have to start this trickle feeding regime until August, as long as your hive has at least 30 pounds of honey stored up in that second brood box. So kind of along with that, the goal throughout the summer is to maintain 30 to 40 pounds of surplus syrup or honey in the second brood box. That's your goal. 30 pounds, for point of reference, is 1 medium box 90% full or 1 deep box 2/3 full of honey. You also need to, I recommend adding Pro Health to each feeding of syrup. That really helps boost the bee's immune system a bit, encourages them to eat the syrup, etc. That Pro Health is just a mixture of essential oils that we sell. I would test for mites now. So if, pull your honey here in the next couple of weeks and test for mites. I would recommend feeding 2 pollen patties each month. This says July through October. You can if you want to go above and beyond. Otherwise, I'd say August through October. I do recommend feeding Pro Diafilm. That's the probiotic mixture that we sell that is really helpful in keeping the bees healthy. And then you can always equalize brood between hives if needed. So if you've got a really strong hive and a weaker hive, you could take a frame of brood out of that stronger hive, shake the bees off, give it to a weaker hive to boost up their strength. Cooling hives, I'm going to touch on this quickly, and then we're going to get to the elims. We're still doing pretty good on time. So cooling hives, it's a big question a lot of folks have, is how do I keep my bees cool during the summer? The bees typically do a pretty good job on their own. A couple things I recommend. I love screen bottom boards. Not only can you slip that sticky Varroa sticky board underneath them to test for Varroa mites, but they also give bees plenty of ventilation. There have been some studies done that have shown bees with screen bottom boards often have a couple more frames of brood than those that don't. So I'm a big fan of screen bottom boards, and you can also crack the lid a bit, like I showed in that video. You can put your hives in the shade, though I recommend putting your bees in the full sun, or in a perfect world, partial shade in the afternoon and full sun the rest of the day. And then finally, you can add an empty box on top of your hive, like you see in the far right picture here. And that gives them some dead air space, keeps that hot sun from beating down directly on top of the lid, which is directly on top of the hive, to keep them a bit cooler. If you've got a really strong hive, you might want to make sure frames are in that empty box, because they might start drawing out excess honeycomb up there. But for most hives, they won't this time of year because there's no nectar blooming. So the last person we're going to jump to today before the elims is Tara Chapman, and she's going to tell us quickly about how she keeps hives cool during the summer.
It gets really hot here in Texas in the summer, and I think it's counterintuitive to a lot of folks that we do put our hives in full sun. We do that, of course, because it helps with ventilation and it helps control small hive beetle. But outside of that, we don't provide shade for our bees. If we can find a spot where they get morning sun and they get a couple of hours of afternoon shade, that's kind of the gold star of a site. I just find that's really, really hard to find. So most of our hives are in full sun, and we don't hang shade cloth or do anything to provide them any additional shade during the summer. I feel very strongly that the bees can handle it just fine. I think that it's much harder for them to control pests than it is the temperature. So I'll err on the side of doing what I need to control for the pest, meaning putting them in full sun. But I do think it is really important to make sure that your hives have access to water, particularly in the months of July probably through September, which are the hottest months of the year here in Texas, because not only do they need that water for hydration, but they use the water as an evaporative cooling system in the hive to help keep the hive cool. So for us, just making sure our bees have access to good water, and it doesn't have to be clean water. Bees don't actually prefer clean water. They prefer it to be a bit dirtier, probably because it has some, maybe minerals in it that they really like. So making sure our bees have access to water is what we stress.
Fantastic. So there you have it. Post-harvest hive configuration. This is a quick side note. I kind of like Tara alluded to, and I mentioned earlier, but I recommend hives have a minimum of 2 boxes or shade. If you're running single brood boxes, I like to have them in the shade, but ideally two brood boxes at a minimum and in the sun. I ideally use 2 brood boxes and 1 empty super, so 3 boxes tall, kind of like you see on this bottom right image, if both brood boxes are mostly full of bees. So if you've got 2 brood boxes pretty much completely full of bees, I like putting a 3rd box, and I'll go back and pull it off later in the year, usually once it starts cooling off in September or October. I'll pull that top box off if the bees haven't filled it up. But it creates just a bit of a dead air space up there and keeps the hive a bit cooler. I want to show you guys a quick video of robbing, because it's also a common question. And the Elams are going to talk about this in more depth and show another video. But if you've never seen robbing behavior, this is what it looks like. A million bees trying to get into all the cracks and crevices in the hive. And the Elams will be talking a bit about what to watch for and why robbing is an issue. Final note, post-harvest super care. Once you harvest your honey, don't forget to store them in a freezer or with wax moth crystals, because this time of year, wax moths will eat all the honeycomb out of your honey supers if it's not being protected by the bees. So when you extract that honey, store those boxes in wax moth crystals. We've got a video on our YouTube channel that goes over how to do that in detail, so check that out. Okay, Elams, with that, it's the show is yours with the time we've got left, and I'll jump into answering those questions. So good luck, guys.
Fantastic. One waiting for you. It was
Great.
it's a good
Can't
one.
wait.
Let me get my screen pulled
Hi, the
up.
Elams are here.
They are. They are. We're here. Okay. Let me get mine.
We're going to title our
There we go.
program, How to Tell When the Honey Flow is Over. You know, we have two favorite times of the year: when the honey flow starts and when the honey
It's
flow
over.
ends. When the honey flow starts, it's because we have the most dynamic time of year with our populations growing. And when the honey flow ends, it's extraction time.
Yay.
So a lot of things happen in between the two
Let the
time
work
periods.
begin. Let the work
Yeah.
begin. Definitely. Well, this is the time of year, especially if you're a new beekeeper, that you're wondering, when in the world can I keep putting boxes on? Because I think that's probably one of the most common questions that we get, especially the end of June, 1st of July, is for newer beekeepers, can I put a box on, a super on now? Probably not. Probably not. It's getting a little bit
Yeah.
late to do that.
That key word, honey flow. When we talk about honey flows, there are nectar flows. There are two main factors that contribute to a successful nectar flow. One is available nectar,
Mhm.
and one is weather that cooperates with us. So sometimes we have stops and starts in our nectar flow,
Yes.
but our main nectar flow continues up to the point where the nectar obviously stops flowing. So we're reaching that in most of the state.
Are
Blake
you-
mentioned that Mesquite, I think, is still doing well,
Mhm.
but most of the state is pretty much shut down.
Well, and I think mesquite just started in a lot of areas. And you talk about the weather. We've had a little rain in our area. We've had a lot of rain in our area. There's several places in Texas that have had a lot of rain. That can kind of extend things a little bit as I move to the time of year. It really can extend the honey flow for some areas. It can even kind of help keep the weather cooled down a little bit, so the bees are a little happier for that. But time of year is really starts being your first thought of when is the nectar flow over. Our area, all of Texas really, is mid-June to July 4th, which is this weekend.
Well, one thing's for certain is that heat and drought will force a nectar flow to end,
Amen.
even if the months don't correspond.
That's true.
Once the weather gets too hot,
Mhm.
the earth comes,
Mhm.
and our nectar flows truly shut down. The
Mhm.
trees stop blooming, the flowers stop blooming.
Mhm.
Roadside flowers
Mhm.
may be in place, but their intensity of nectar production goes down dramatically. We look at the pictures and shows, I guess, I don't know what kind of flowers those are on the
I don't know,
left,
because it was already
but they're
dead when I
dry.
took
I
it.
can see that. It looks like they came from one of the Hobby Lobby stores.
Dried
The
arrangement.
center one is a favorite in our area, tallow. And when the tallow tassels dry up, which those are in the process of doing,
Mhm.
the nectar is gone.
Mhm.
There's nothing to work with. So those are awesome indicators. And look at the mower on the right. That's my mower that we cut our yard with.
Don't you wish? I want to back up just a little bit on the flowers and the resources drying up. It's going to be different in different areas. We are Southeast Texas, so our primary is the Chinese tallow. But depending on your area, you may see this happen sooner or later. Getting to know what is blooming and what's your primary resource for pulling in your honey is key. So learning what those are. I remember the day that it keyed in on me that the Chinese tallow was it, and we were seeing that every year prior to being beekeepers, and it was like we heard a choir sing, because there it was right in front of our faces. Truly, the roadside mowers, I used to get frustrated because they were so much quicker, and I even was guilty of picking up the phone and calling the county commissioners and saying, you better not mow until we're done with all of the flowers, because they really were jumping ahead doing that. And you just wish that was your mower, don't you? That would take care of business.
Well, ideally, they're cutting that down when the flowers are drying up. And we had a question from Tom earlier, said that my bees seem extremely more defensive right now. And I answered him by saying that it's normal for the bee attitudes, and that's not a religious statement, for the attitudes of bees to change when there's a ending of nectar flow, when a dearth is beginning in your area. Bees are used to being proactive, going out and foraging and doing something, so their attitudes can completely change.
Oh, they can. They really can. They it's kind of like that. They can spot you now after you pulled the honey boxes off, the supers off. It's like that they can spot you as you're walking up to hive just to peek. They're just not as friendly as they were earlier. You're going to see hive activity reduce. They just don't have as much to do as they did. No new nectar being brought in. You very well may see frames, uncapped frames of honey go uncapped. They may not cap it, but like Blake showed in the video out there in the bee yard up in Collin County, is you can do that shake test, and if it doesn't shake out, it's cured. But odds are they're not going to go in and cap this once the nectar flow is over, because there's nothing to produce that white wax, that would cap it. So if it's not capped by the time the flowers have dried up and all these things that we're leading to, it's not going to get capped.
That is a good point, though. When you look in your hive and see, especially like that frame on the right, you see a portion of it's capped and a portion of it's uncapped. If that remains static, nothing's changing, that's an indicator to you that the nectar flow has ended. And while the bees may want to cap it, all they're left with is the ability to cure it.
Right.
So they can cure it, they can dry it so that you can harvest it. But a static frame like that is an awesome indicator that the nectar flow has ended.
It is, and don't be surprised if your bees do start checking out your bee equipment sitting in the barn. Familiar odors to them, the beekeeper, your suit, if it's hanging out there, they really will start checking out things that we're just trying to seek out that nectar source. It's unusual to watch them do that, because we do start seeing a little bit different activity as they are winding down. They become bored.
I expect that most of you, or a lot of you, are familiar with the frenzy that occurs when robbing is happening. And we're going to get to that in a minute. Blake mentioned robbing. But the same thing happens just naturally on its own, like a feeding frenzy is occurring when there's no robbing happening whatsoever. During a dearth, when the bees are desperate to find something, you'll see them flying in places that they typically don't go. They're typically flying lower to the ground. Their flight patterns change. They, like Sherry was saying, that they end up on clothing where you don't normally see it. Right. They're looking for anything that might be a clue that there's a resource. That's right. Coke can in the gas station. Yeah, that's perfect.
Also, bees will start consuming the honey. So that's to us, that's a bell ringing. You don't want them to start consuming the honey that you've left in there. If you're busy, still try to get out there and get those supers pulled off. You don't want them to go in and start taking what they've been building and that you're wanting to extract. So
that happened to us about 10 years ago.
It did.
We had a colony that had a very early start on filling the supers. We went out one weekend and they were full, they were ready, but we went out late in the day. We didn't pull them like we should have.
Right.
We said we'll do it next week. We went back next week and it was gone.
It was gone.
The weather was bad. The bees were trapped. And they consumed all the honey that was in that upper super. So, don't put off till tomorrow what you can do today, if that's possible.
Knowing the difference between uncapped honey and bees that are eating the honey, I've been eating honey, it has a little bit of a jagged edge. In other words, they decap that honey. You will tell that it looks like it's got a jagged edge. So there is a difference. It's smooth edges around that's never been capped. and kind of jagged around that they're consuming. Plus you'll see them there, like these little girls here in that bottom picture, they're in there consuming it. Get that off of there and can start feeding instead. Gives them also something to do.
Something else that I thought about regarding sounds or inside the hive is the sounds of a colony change inside the hive. When there's a true nectar dearth, when the honey flow is over, your colony temperament does change. There's a sound very similar to what a queenless colony might have, and that something is different. And if you're involved with your bees on a regular basis, you'll know that something's different. You saw this video earlier from Blake.
No, he changed his.
Oh, he changed it? Okay.
Yeah, he did.
Well, here's a new one. But robbing is robbing.
It is. And when robbing starts, I can tell you, you better stop it quick because this will decimate a colony. Several things will happen to start robbing. Nectar flow being over, and if you've got hives of different strengths side by side, you've got one that's weaker here and stronger, they literally will go and take from that weaker hive, and they can take that hive over within a matter of hours, literally hours. Someone has made I'm gonna call it a homemade robbing screen right there. We obviously have the commercial version that are store-bought, but you're gonna want to have one of those at the ready, because once that happens, you're going to need to stop it quick. Throwing a sheet over it can help, a wet sheet over it, or even turning on a water sprinkler will help. But this is also a good indicator that they're not being able to find nectar in nature, so they're going to be opportunistic and find it from their neighbor.
That's the key word. Bees are opportunistic. We've all learned that if we spill sugar syrup, we can set off a robbing frenzy. If we mishandle a honey super, leaving it open too long, we can have bees that are just being totally destructive in our eyes, but they're being opportunistic in their eyes. When we see a robbing occur and there's no known cause, generally it is because a dearth has occurred, the nectar flow is over, and the bees are just doing what bees do. Bees like to hoard, and they're hoarding. So at the right time of year, if this was the second week of July or June to the middle of July, odds are that's a sign right there that the nectar flow is in.
Right. So this is really kind of our last slide. I've got one that's kind of pretty coming up, but knowing what's foraging, what your bees forage on in your area is key. And paying attention to what the flowers are doing, what your bees are doing, the sounds in your hive, paying attention to our webinar, the magazine, really watching, you're going to know exactly when it's time to put supers on, when it's time to take them off.
One of the things that I really like, though, is being able to tell the difference between open nectar when bees are consuming it or when bees are adding to it. That's a fun one. Study that and plan for it. And a lot of that can be told not only with the cappings, but with the thickness of the nectar. Is it cured, or is it just brand new 80% water nectar?
That's right. And we had a very short program tonight. Blake covered a lot of material and it was good stuff. And y'all know that is going to come to your inbox in a recorded version. So if you missed anything or you want to go back and hear it again, just look at that recorded version in your inbox or on the YouTube channel. And happy 4th of July. It's supposed to be raining in Southeast Texas, and Saturday's my birthday. And it's going to be raining, but that's okay. I'm still another year older. I'm happy with that. All right, Blake, back to you.
Fantastic. Well, happy early birthday, Sherry. That's all right. Okay, folks, just one quick note before you guys leave. We are going to try something new in August that I want to make you guys aware of, where if you ever have ideas for how to make these webinars better, let us know. But we're going to try something new. So in August, we are going to bring on 1 or 2 new speakers, and the last 20 to 30 minutes of the presentation, we're going to have something called Breakout Rooms, which means that you can choose what speaker you want to go listen to at the last 30 minutes of the presentation. So the first 30 minutes will be very similar to what we've always done. Last 30 minutes, we'll have 2 or 3 different speakers talking about 2 or 3 different topics. You'll be aware of those topics ahead of time. And it's really smooth. It's really simple. You just select which speaker you want to go listen to, and it'll be just like this webinar, but you get to pick the topic. So we're going to try that. We're going to ask for your feedback afterwards and see if you loved it or hated it. And if you loved it, we'll just keep expanding on that comment, on that method. But everything before that will be just like it always is. We'll still have the video out in the bee yard, the monthly tips, etc. And then the 2 or 3 speakers at that last 30 minutes will be 100% practical, applicable to that month as well. They'll just take a little bit deeper dive. So with that, watch for a follow-up email. It'll have the webinar recording. It'll have links to all the products and videos, links to our magazine. It'll have that those discount codes that we talked about, the 20% off that long list of products. It'll have all of that on there as well. So with that, folks, we will see you in August. If you've got more questions, feel free to continue putting them in the Q&A box. We'll hang out and answer them just as long as we can. But otherwise, we will see you in August. And hey, stay cool and happy 4th of July.